Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to Christopher Hawthorne. For the last 13 years, Christopher was the architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times, but back in March, he left that position to take on a brand new role as Los Angeles's first chief design officer. Working under the mayor there, Christopher is tasked with thinking about the public space and the development of the city, as well as engaging with the citizens in conversations around design and architecture and planning in Los Angeles. He's also taught at Occidental College, U.C Berkeley, Columbia University, and the Southern California Institute of Architecture. But I was really interested in talking with Christopher about this new role and how he's been thinking through this transition. We talk about what it means to be a critic and how that's influenced his new job, as well as how he can use that writing background to help shape the public conversation around the future of design in Los Angeles. We also talk about his very early interest in architecture criticism when he started reading Paul Goldberger as a high school student, and how the role of the architecture critic, or the position of being a critic at a newspaper, has changed over the course of his career. This was such a fascinating conversation for me. Christopher has long been one of my favorite architecture writers, and he's just so incredibly smart and articulate. And as this podcast has increasingly looked at the design of cities and urbanism and public space, I don't think there's a better person to talk to than Christopher, and especially from this kind of new position that he's in now. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. I throw in links from the month, as well as write kind of short little essays. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Christopher Hawthorne. I usually start these conversations with just a little bit of background information, and I especially like talking to critics and talking to writers about their background, because I'm always fascinated by kind of what came first in your interest. Were you interested in kind of being a writer, or was architecture the thing that kind of got you into writing, or was it the other way around?
It was really both. So I suppose the answer is depends how far we want to go back.
That's up to you.
If we want to go back to early childhood, I grew up in a house designed by Julie Morgan, who was the most prolific and most significant female architect in California in the 20th century. And she designed a house in North Berkeley, finished in 1920, where I grew up and where my parents still live. And so that was probably the beginning of my interest.
Oh, wow.
And as a result of buying that house, my parents became in architecture. And my mom led architectural walking tours, and did programs in the Berkeley public schools around architecture, and helped found the Berkeley Architectural Heritage Association, which was one of the many historic preservation groups that sprung up in American cities in the 1970s. So she took my third grade class, for example, at Thousand Oaks School in Berkeley on walking tours of different neighborhood architecture. So it was really the combination of living in that house and having exposure to those tours and seeing my mom's own interest that was the beginning. And then in high school, though, I edited my high school paper, the Berkeley High Jacket. I was very interested in writing, and I was even aware by that point of architectural criticism because of Paul Goldberger's work in the New York Times.
Right.
And I think we had a subscription to the New York Times whenever they started offering it in California. I'd have to go back and see what year that was when home delivery. I mean, I remember my parents driving out to get the paper at the places in Berkeley that sold the New York Times. And then I remember to go back and ask my parents what year that was when we started getting home delivery as it was available.
I love that.
To Californians. And so I was aware of Paul Goldberger's work and the idea that there was a job called architecture critic. And I didn't really, so my interest was, even though I had this longstanding interest in architecture, I was not artistically inclined. I was, so I knew that my talent, such as it was, even in high school, was on the writing side of that equation. And then I went to college at Yale and studied, took Vincent Scully's
Nice.
courses, and because of those and the Paul Goldberger connection to Yale, was even more aware of an idea that there was a career possible in architecture that wasn't about designing buildings, but was about being a historian or a critic. And so I think my specific ambition to be an architecture critic probably started then.
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't hear that story very often. I've been thinking about this. This is somewhat related about how kids get interested in a specific topic. Whether it's architecture, and you think, well, then the goal is to be an architect. And so it's really interesting that you kind of were able to. One, you saw that there was another way into this thing you were interested in, but then two, were able to kind of discern that your talents weren't in maybe being an architect, but in writing about it. Is actually kind of really interesting. So when you went to Yale, the goal was you're going to be an architecture critic. That was the plan.
Not when I set out as a freshman, I wouldn't say, but I certainly knew that I was interested, and it's not as smooth as I'm making it perhaps sound, because in those days, there was no history or theory track in the architecture major. I think that's right, and they now have that.
Oh, okay.
So I was not able to major in architecture despite my interest, and so I was a political science, specifically political philosophy major.
Oh, interesting.
But I was always, particularly in the last couple of years, I would say the latter half of my undergraduate career, I was much more interested in architecture than poli-sci, and so I was taking as many architecture courses as I could, even though it wasn't my major. And then most majors at Yale, you have to write a senior essay, and so I was determined to get as much architecture into that paper as I could. So I actually had advisors in both departments, and I wrote a paper that sort of split the difference between those. So I wrote a senior essay looking at spaces that were used for political protest and earned a reputation as centers of political protest, and analyzing them from a design, urban planning, architectural point of view.
Oh, interesting.
Which is to say, asking the question if there's a certain kind of design or approach to design that lends itself to spaces that are used that way, and if they're not necessarily designed for that purpose. And I look specifically at Sproul Plaza on the UC Berkeley campus, which after being remade by Vernon DeMars and Lawrence Halprin and a bunch of modernist architects in the early 1960s, very quickly became the center of this free speech movement protests. And so it was really an excuse just to get as much architecture and planning into a poli-sci senior essay as I could.
I don't mean to do too much, foreshadowing or stretch connections where there aren't any, but I think the political science background, actually ends up kind of foreshadowing what I imagine has a connection now to the work that you're doing now. And I was interested if you saw connections, or were you able to kind of make connections while you're in school between political science and architecture. And it sounds like that was something you were kind of thinking about architecture that way, right? Very early on.
I was, but I've been thinking about that actually quite a bit, as you might imagine, after taking this new job, thinking back to that intersection.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about that as much when I was working as an architecture critic. So, of course, I'm thinking about it now in terms of how political my job is now. But I would say I was attracted to those political philosophers who were writing about space, or, work of Baudrillard was really trendy when I was an undergraduate, or, Henri Lefebvre, or people like that who are writing about, political philosophy that talked about built space. And so I was attracted to that. That kind of work. There was a lot of postmodern theory and philosophy that was being written in that period that also touched on architecture or city making or planning, urban design, that sort of thing. So I did find a kind of way through the scholarship, I would say, to think about those connections. But I haven't thought of them quite as much until starting at City Hall. Yeah,
that's interesting. I want to talk. I want to just kind of finish this thread before we talk about your new role, because you were, and I don't mean to kind of gloss over, your background too much, but you were at the Los Angeles Times for 15 years almost.
Not quite. So about 13 and a
Okay.
half. So almost 14 years. So from the fall of 2004 to early part of this year.
Okay. I have a couple questions kind of about that. So, I imagine, reading Paul Goldberger that, kind of being a architecture critic at a major newspaper was kind of the goal. Like that was the best that someone could do in this line of work, right?
I think that's fair to say. There weren't that many of those jobs,
Well,
and
yeah, that's
I
that's what I was
didn't. Yeah,
getting
I
to.
also didn't really imagine that one would open up. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that I aspired to it in the abstract.
Okay.
But when I was surprised when I got a call from the LA Times. I guess in the spring or summer of 2004.
And how did that happen then?
So my predecessor, Nikolai Russoff, got a job at the New York Times
Okay.
after Herbert Muschamp, and
Right.
that was a period when the New York Times was hiring a number of people away from the LA Times. So Manohla Dargis had just left, I think, right around the same time or soon after,
Right.
the film critic,
Yeah.
and that was really a kind of golden age for the LA Times. So we were already owned by the Tribune Company.
Okay.
So we already had out of town ownership by that point, but the kind of tumult and uncertainty that then marked the next decade of ownership from Chicago had not really affected the paper. And so we were, I think, arguably the LA Times was I still say we, forgive me.
Right.
The LA Times was arguably the best paper in the country at that point. So John Carroll was the editor who hired me. Dean Kay, who's now running the New York Times,
Oh yeah.
was the number two. And there was just a huge amount of ambition. I think we were doing work both internationally and nationally, certainly on the culture pages in the country. So it was to join the paper, but it opened up only because Nikolai went from LA to New York.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you started answering kind of the question that I was, starting to get to, which was, that there aren't a lot of architecture critics at newspapers. And I imagine even since you started that number is increasingly dropping. And I'm curious about kind of that, how that field or that kind of mode of work has changed in those 13 years, and even someone's aspirations who would want to do something like that.
Right, it's changed in a remarkable way. And I should also say, in terms of my childhood, that I should mention Alan Temko's name. He was the architecture critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, who won a Pulitzer. So I was also reading his work when I was a kid, and those were the two papers that arrived, at our house every morning: the
Right.
Chronicle and the New York Times. And he really focused on San Francisco and the Bay Area, but he was doing excellent work throughout those years. And in fact, things. So to answer your question, things have changed, and the ranks, of full-time architecture critics at newspapers have thinned. But there was a moment when that actually happened before I got my job. So when I got out of college, I graduated in 1993. That recession was particularly tough in real estate and architecture,
Right.
and there just wasn't a lot getting built. And so that period, the middle 90s, actually, a lot of newspapers, or some newspapers, were losing their architecture critics and deciding not to replace them, or magazines. So when Alan Temko left, there was actually a gap at the San Francisco Chronicle before John King, who's now still doing very good work there, took on that job. So there was a moment where the ranks seemed to be shrinking even in the middle 90s, and I was just to fill in that part of my background. So I graduated. I moved to Seattle, and I worked very briefly at the Seattle Weekly, Alternative Weekly, and then I traveled around the world for a while. I moved back to the Bay Area in 1994, hoping to write about architecture, but there was just nothing getting built and no pieces being assigned.
Yeah.
And so I got a job at the East Bay Express, which is an alternative weekly. In those days, it was in Emeryville, and I was the arts editor and the theater critic, actually,
Oh, nice.
and writing some film criticism and really hoping for a chance to be writing about architecture and not finding too many opportunities. So I remember I wrote a piece. This may have been the very first review I did. I reviewed the Charles Moore Haas Business School at UC Berkeley.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a really interesting late Moore project, which I think has held up rather well, actually, over the years. But there were just so few things opening. I remember the Gap opened something in San Francisco. There were a couple of projects in the Bay Area, but it was really slim pickings. And so I was doing other work and really focusing my critical work on theater. And that was also a really interesting moment in Bay Area theater. So Carrie Perloff at ACT and Tony Taccone at Berkeley Rep doing a lot of Kushner work and really interesting things happening in Bay Area theater. But I was really looking around for opportunities to be writing about
yeah, that's
buildings.
so interesting.
And it wasn't until I moved to New York to take a fellowship at Columbia in a now, sadly now defunct program called the National Arts Journalism Program, which is a mid-career journalism fellowship for arts and culture writers, not specifically for critics, but it gave me and my now wife an opportunity to move to New York and really take classes in anything that I was interested in. I did a lot of architecture, of course. And but then by the time I finished that fellowship in 1999, the economy had really turned around. Bilbao had opened, and there was this new wave of interest, and suddenly it seemed that most newspaper and magazine art editors were looking to commission architecture pieces again, which made it possible for me to start writing full-time just about architecture, which I was able to do for the first time in New York in 99 after finishing that program at Columbia.
Yeah, it's interesting, that you mentioned Bilbao. I read another interview that you had done in preparing for this, and I forget which one it was, but you mentioned Bilbao, and the person interviewing you, kind of remarked that the Bilbao effect didn't just affect architects, but also affected architecture writing in a lot of ways, which I thought was actually a kind of really interesting analysis there, and you kind of were able to ride that wave, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. So it was not just Bilbao. It was the economy turning around. It was, the Getty opened the same fall as Bilbao, 1997. There was suddenly a lot of it was the beginning, I guess, of what we now think of as the architecture era.
Right.
But, every magazine editor seemed to think that architecture was a subject that they really needed to be covering.
Right.
And so it was, and I had the luxury of having a year in New York to meet, to build some relationships with editors. And I started doing some work for Metropolis and, Martin Peterson, whose name you've probably heard from other guests, was one of my editors there and was commissioning pieces. And I was, working with a lot of really smart young writers and editors. And then Michael Cannell was editing Architecture Magazine, or he was an editor at Architecture Magazine, and he then went on to the New York Times and became my editor there. And I was writing for Slate for Jodi Kantor, who's now become very famous for her work on the Harvey Weinstein and Me Too stories. But she was my editor at Slate, where I was their first architecture critic, and then she moved to the New York Times, and I wrote for her and other people there. So it was just a moment this is sort of late 90s, early 2000s, when there seemed to be a significant and new demand for architecture coverage.
Right. And so how did that, so then you settle in, you get this job in LA, you kind of settle into that. I'm interested in kind of how you saw your role now that you were like within an institution, this was your job. How did that role change over your time at the paper?
I think I came into it really wanting to write more about urbanism, planning, and the politics that surround architecture than my predecessor had. So Nikolai's focus was much more on, architects and buildings in a, I suppose one could say, more traditional sense. But I was interested in writing about the city and fascinated in large part by how much I had to learn about Los Angeles. So another part of that transition for me was I had moved back from New York to the Bay Area, and I was teaching at the journalism school at UC Berkeley, when Orville Schell was the dean, and he had a remarkable group of writers teaching there. And so Orville's a China expert, and we had cooked up a plan to do a class on cities and what was kind of the first stirrings of the kind of globalization, wave. And we had cooked up this idea to do a class on a different city every spring, and they had some money to take the students to travel.
Oh, nice.
So we decided we'd do a course on Shenzhen as a kind of study of the instant, kind of just add water Chinese.
Right.
With some advice from Orville about how that might look. And I was beginning to put together a syllabus in the early stages when I got the job offer from the LA Times. And so I went back and forth between the Bay Area and LA for the first year of the job because my wife had just taken a new job in San Francisco. We had just had our first kid, and so they gave me a year to sort of go back and forth. And so I was continuing to teach this class, and I quickly realized that I needed to remake that Shenzhen course and make it a course about Los Angeles as a way to do all the reading that I knew I was going to need to do anyway. So that was, I think I'd read a little Banham and a little Mike Davis, City of Quartz by that point, but I put all those people on the syllabus, and it was really, reading through that canon of literature as a way to get myself more firmly situated in Los Angeles and sort of learn everything I needed to learn. So I was fascinated by the city and how difficult it can be to read or understand as an outsider. So that was an interest of mine, and I knew that I wanted to write about the city and other cities too. I wanted to write about planning. And in those early days, just in terms of my approach, but I was also interested in the full spectrum of criticism and really writing about individual buildings as well. So we had, a travel budget that probably is not in place at the LA Times or other places. So I was basically, if there was a new building somewhere around the world, I was basically able to make the case to my editors that I needed to go see it. So
nice.
I was able to do a lot of traveling in those early years, and we were also really ambitious as a paper in terms of our the LA Times still has a remarkable group of critics, and early on, this is the kind of assignment that is remarkable when you're early in a job like that. One of my editors said, we're doing this package with the travel section where we're going to send each critic to a different city around the world, and we want you to nominate 4 or 5 cities that would be of interest in your field. And so I can't remember all the cities on my list, but there were some Latin American cities, and they ended up and some Asian ones, and they sent me to Shanghai for a week to write about the architecture of Shanghai. While the movie critics were going to other cities, and the classical music critic was going somewhere else, and the food critic somewhere else, and writing about those cities through the lens of criticism in their particular field. So, and there were a lot of those kind of package critical stories, as I recall, that were a kind of sign, as I was saying, of the ambition of the paper in those days. So there was another moment where they asked all the critics to write an essay on regret, which is to say, was there ever a review that we regretted? Oh, interesting. And I think what I said was that I've never regretted my judgment about a building, and that sort of judgment hits me really quickly. But every time I've regretted some part of how I phrased, how I made the argument. Right? So I always regret the writing part of it. I've never come to feel that I made a disastrously
that's interesting
bad judgment about the quality of the architecture itself. So it's more a question of how to articulate the feeling that you get, the judgment that you're making almost instantaneously. But I always regret how I phrase something, and I always wish I could go back and rewrite it, not the judgment itself.
Kind of going off of that, how did you see your role as someone who was both writing about the city, writing about individual buildings in the city, potentially writing about people in the city for people who live there, where you're kind of this person that's between all of these parties, whether it is the government or the architects or the builders or the public. What did you see as your role in writing about that, and in kind of communicating between those groups?
I think it shifted over time. I think I was careful at the beginning. I was mindful of not getting on too many soapboxes too early. in terms of, what we might think of as activist criticism, I did a lot more of that later on in my tenure.
Okay.
Because I did have a sense that I had a lot to learn about the city, and the last thing I wanted to do is come in and lecture Angelenos about their own city when I was still getting to know it. So I was careful about that, but I did want to situate architecture and architecture criticism within a larger discussion about the future of the city. That was very important to me from the beginning, and I think there was a real interest and hunger among readers to have that kind of conversation about the city. And it was clear from those early days that the city was beginning to navigate a significant transition, which it's still navigating, trying to establish its kind of 21st century or post-suburban identity. And that there was a lot of, I think it struck me really early on that there was a lot of material to be mined in that vein. And so I was very interested in those kind of larger questions about planning and urbanism, preservation, how the city thinks about history. One of my early pieces was on the debate over the fate of the Ambassador Hotel, which when I started, so this is late 2004, early 2005, it was owned by the LAUSD, the school district, and there were plans in place to replace the hotel, which had been out of use for many years, with a complex of schools. And some of your listeners will probably be aware of the history of that building, but it was designed by Myron Hunt. It was the site of many of the early Academy Award ceremonies.
Oh, okay.
It was the site where Bobby Kennedy was shot in 1968. He didn't die on the site, but he was shot in the pantry leading off of the auditorium at the Ambassador in June of 1968. So it had this amazing cultural and political history on top of its architectural significance. But although Donald Trump did own the site for a while.
Are you serious?
Yes, he proposed.
Wow.
What would have been the tallest building on the West Coast
for
the site. By the time I was writing about it, the sort of opponents of the preservation groups in town were not, black-hatted developers like Donald Trump. They were a school district who wanted to build a complex of schools in a part of the city that was really desperately in need of more schools, and where some kids were being bused all the way to the San Fernando Valley, so spending a couple hours, if not more, on the bus every day. And it was a heavily Latino, particularly immigrant neighborhood, and so it was a really complicated set of questions and complicated calculus. And so the essay that I wrote was just about how do you try to think about that calculus when you have a building that has a certain architectural significance on top of a certain cultural and political significance, given the Academy Awards Hollywood connection, and the Cocoa nightclub was also there, and then given the fact that it was the site of the site of Bobby Kennedy's shooting. So all of that wrapped together suggested a really interesting and complicated question about how we deal with memory, history, and preservation in Los Angeles, which is a city, of course, always that hasn't always tended to its own architectural past particularly well or thoughtfully.
That actually leads into kind of your new role, because in March you left your job at the Times and became the Los Angeles' chief design officer. And so I have two questions around that. One, I would love for you to just kind of describe what a chief design officer for a city like Los Angeles does, or what that role is, or kind of how you, now that you've been in a couple months, how it's shaping up. And then two, and a little bit maybe sub question, is how that even came about, and was that something you were looking for, or how did this kind of seem like the next step for you?
The job, I think the easiest way to describe it is that I am the chief architecture across the city, and it's a position that's appointed by Eric Garcetti, the mayor. And so that apathy, it really falls, I would say, into three categories. There are specific sites and projects that I'm looking at that the mayor or someone else has asked me to look at or have significant importance, and we really want to get them right from an architecture design point of view. Mm-hmm. So there's a list of those projects and sites that I've been working on, and they're in varying degrees of completion in terms of design. So some are very early in the design process, and I'm really engaged in a wide-ranging set of questions about their goals as works of architecture. Some are much further along the design process, and I'm working with the architects and agencies to kind of refine the design, improve it in ways. So that's one category. The second category is initiatives that I'm trying to launch myself from this office, and that has to do in part with the larger policy frameworks that we're making across the city. So we're redoing our zoning code for the first time since the 40s, writing community plans for neighborhoods across the city, and those projects are underway but not finished. And I think to the extent that there's some policy changes or tweaks or goals that we have in the mayor's office, there's an opportunity to fold some of those into those larger frameworks, which are largely being overseen by the planning department. And then other initiatives that have to do with, rethinking how we do design review across the city, thinking in connection with that ambassador piece, we think about history and memory. Not only do we, so that involves some specific preservation initiatives. I'd really like to extend our, we have a very, very comprehensive, well-designed database of historic resources called Survey LA, which was executed by the planning department with funding from the Getty other sources, and it ends in 1980, and I'm interested in capacity through the 80s and 90s, because I think we have a particularly rich stock of buildings from that period, early work by the LA school architects, Frank Gehry, Morphosis, Frank Israel, long list, and I think we're seeing in battle, in preservation debates over the AT&T building in New York, or the Thompson Center in Chicago, or even more recently the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego with its Venturi Scott Brown edition. More and more, I think cities are going to be grappling with preservation debates over really recent architecture, so architecture from the 80s or even the mid or late 90s. And a lot of preservation advocacy tends to be focused on older buildings, or think about a kind of 50-year threshold for determining the importance of a building. So I'm really interested in putting together some kind of catalog of our important landmarks from the 80s and 90s, and then having some public conversations and building a kind of sophistication and constituency for those buildings, so that when we do start to have those debates, which we will inevitably, we have the beginnings of a public conversation about what about those buildings and that architectural moment is important to us. And then in a larger sense, just thinking about how we can engage in a more thoughtful way with history and memory in our new projects. We have had a tendency in the city, when we're faced with difficult sites, to kind of sweep the site clean and go for a kind of tabula rasa solution. We're not unique in that, but I'm interested in a couple of particular sites I'm looking at now, whether we can have a design and planning approach that is willing to engage with sometimes fraught and difficult history, rather than trying to wipe that slate clean. So there are a number of those initiatives that touch on policy, preservation, history. I'm thinking in the opposite direction in terms of putting together some design guidelines for new mobility, for example. So thinking about the urban design implications of everything from scooters and e-bikes to autonomous vehicles to, eventually the world of flying, passenger drones and flying taxis and the kind of gondolas, which we're planning a couple of in the city. So,
interesting.
Which is fascinating to me to think about the kind of public right-of-way, which we have thought about as extending in 2 dimensions along roadways, now extending into the air and into 3 dimensions, and thinking about what the urban design implications of all of that are. So those are among the, some of them, as I said, will have very specific kinds of goals, and some will be somewhat more amorphous. I'm really interested, for example, in the question of shade in an era of climate change as an equity issue. So when we as we're trying to reinvest in our public realm, which is really a significant part of infrastructure and public investment in Los Angeles at the moment, and will be for the next generation. In an era of climate change, the exposure to heat and sun, really tends to fall on our most vulnerable. And so thinking about shade, that question of how you fold, if more shade is a goal from a policy point of view, again, in a rather amorphous fashion, how do you fold that into specific policy goals? Is that something that goes into a zoning or a community plan process? And if so, what are the mechanisms beyond tree canopy that might achieve that? Those kinds of places where a broader goal meets a specific set of policy questions is where I'm most interested in applying my work. And then the third category is public engagement. So the mayor is very interested in that public conversation, which and building kind of more sophisticated dialogue around issues connected to architecture, planning, urban design. And that leads to the answer to the second part of your question, which is about how this came about. I have taught for many years at Occidental College here in Los Angeles, and I do a public affairs series as part of that work. So I teach a seminar in the spring that is held Wednesday evenings, and every few weeks the class time is given over to a public event connected to the future of Los Angeles in one way or another. So I did an event with the mayor after he was elected in the very early version of that series, talking about architecture planning, really for a full 90 minutes or so. He's very interested and smart about these issues. And then when he was reelected, he asked if we could do it again. So we did a second version of that conversation at Occidental, and we started talking in that conversation of just about how other cities approach this kind of question, how to build more ambition around architecture and design, and a more sophisticated conversation into a kind of into an administration, which and that is something that he had been thinking about long before that. I think from the early days of his administration, and the other wrinkle, which was interesting, and part of how I was writing about his reelection, was that the electoral calendar was moved in Los Angeles so that although he's term limited to 2 terms. The second term was extended because of a shift from elections from spring of odd years to fall of even years. And so his second term,
interesting.
So 4 years is about 5.5 years, which pushes his 2 terms close almost to a decade.
Right.
And a decade at a moment when Los Angeles is going through this shift that I talked about earlier, and this is really what makes, in some ways, this opportunity really fascinating and compelling in terms of why I was interested in making this leap, is that we have, as a city and county, we have taxed ourselves to pay for transit, for new parks, open space, housing. A lot of investment is connected to the river. We have the Olympics coming in 10 years. And so there's been a very clear message from the voters that we want to invest, and we're willing to tax ourselves to pay for investment in new infrastructure, new kinds of mobility and transportation, but also in public space and open space and parks, and in rethinking our housing strategies. And so there's funding attached to a huge number of those initiatives. The last transit measure alone, Measure M, passed in 2016, will raise something like $120 billion.
Oh, wow. Not
all of it earmarked for transit. There's roadway and other measures in there, but the lion's share of it to public transit. So the decisions about how that money is spent, particularly as it relates to the issues that I'm working on, urban design and architecture, will largely be made in the next few years. And so it seemed like a really opportune moment to be taking on a position like this and thinking about a more coordinated strategy about architecture and planning.
Yeah. I have a couple more quick questions, but I want to kind of respond to that for a second. I have hearing you talk about that, I have a little bit of a theory that I haven't fully articulated. I'd love to kind of run it by you and see what you think, because I was really struck by the second part of your answer about public engagement, and I think there's something really key to that side of it, to the role of a chief design officer for a city, and especially a big city like Los Angeles. And I think it would be really easy and perhaps reductive to see a chief design officer role as just being someone that's kind of creating some sort of unified design system or architecture system or urban system for the city. And I think without that public engagement side, it becomes a sort of Robert Moses-esque role where it's kind of just person on high kind of directing out the city, directing how the city is built. But then when you add in this kind of task of engaging the public and almost raising the public's consciousness or awareness of design, it moves it away from that Moses type role into something that's very communal. And I'm wondering if that is why a job like this, someone like you is perfect for that, of coming from a critic's perspective, where a critic is kind of doing that also. You know what I mean?
Yes. I have many thoughts on this.
Okay, great.
On this set of questions, I would say first that was part of, I think, why as the mayor has explained it, part of why he thought of me for this job is that I have a body of work as a critic where I have certainly not been afraid to have a point of view,
right,
and was in fact paid to have a point of view about particular projects and buildings and architecture more broadly. But that I had been doing this series of convenings through this third Los Angeles series at Occidental. And then it was that combination of things, having a point of view and certainly a set of ambitions, and having articulated that point of view and those ambitions in my writing, but also using the platform of the Oxy series to kind of engage in a broader conversation. I would say there's no city that has no big city in America that has fewer platforms for that kind of conversation than Los Angeles historically, and no city needs them more at the present moment,
right?
Because of how much is changing. But to the Robert Moses point, I'm sure many people listening in Los Angeles at least will laugh at that, because I think we have the opposite problem.
Interesting.
Far from giving rise to a Robert Moses, we have a structure of governance that is really fragmented.
Okay.
And
you keep in mind this is coming from someone in New York.
Exactly. I'm interested in the history of this, but to a certain extent, it was by design. That people coming here, particularly when Los Angeles was kind of first articulating a set of civic goals in the teens and 20s, when the city was really growing by leaps and bounds, a lot of people who were coming from elsewhere were coming from places where machine politics, were really shaping those cities. This is pre-Robert Moses, but let's say, coming from New York or Chicago, and wanting a city that was organized differently. And so part of it was strategic, but more than that is just a kind of the way that the structures of governance have grown up over time. There's a lot of space, let's say, between city, county, and then other agencies that are entirely outside of either. So we have, Metro is doing this transit expansion. That's a county agency, although there are seats that the mayor controls. The LAUSD is independent of city control, and then there is historically a lot of interest in and work done by individual city council offices around planning and land use decisions. And so the result of that is a kind of fragmented system where there has been less of a common sort of civic vision. And I think the mayor, as he's explained it, is interested in exactly as you said it. I think sees this role as a way to broaden the conversation, but not be prescriptive. And the great history of LA architecture is the kind of eclecticism, independence, variety, idiosyncrasy even of that work. So this is in some ways the challenge of an opportunity of the job in a nutshell, because the great strength of Los Angeles has been its openness, its tolerance. It's a place where you can come. It's openness to new ideas and innovation in a whole bunch of realms. The idea here that has been a great vehicle for individual ambition of all kinds, from Hollywood to architecture, to the art world. The flips, and nobody really cares what anybody else is doing, and it's very tolerant in a fantastic way in that sense. The flip side of that is it's been a very difficult place and a tricky place to advance a kind of collective vision of what we want to be as a city and region. But we need that conversation to happen more, given this massive investment that we're making in infrastructure and other projects that touch on the public realm. So the challenge is how to, I would say for me, take some of the innovation and experimentation that has marked the great private realm architecture, residential architecture of Los Angeles, and bring it into the public projects that we're investing in so heavily. And then B, how to strike some kind of a balance between, that tolerance and openness to new ideas with the need for a kind of more coherent idea about, how various new public realm projects relate to one another, and then how that relates again also to private development in terms of promoting better architecture on the private side as well.
What has it been like to go from being someone, basically kind of on the outside writing about this to being someone who's actually like very much involved in shaping the development of the city? Has that kind of shift in perspective changed how you think about these things?
It has, and that was one of the really attractive things about the job. So when you asked me, why I decided to do it, it was difficult, and to the extent that my old job was really the only job, as we discussed, that I ever aspired to have,
right.
And I was really felt lucky to have it. And I also had it at a moment when Los Angeles was, the most interesting city in the country to write about. I don't think there's any doubt about that, given how much is changing, especially for a critic who was interested not just in buildings, but in, the kind of larger forces shaping the city. Yeah. There's no city where as much is up for grabs as is the case in Los Angeles. And so that was difficult to give up, and I had a huge amount of autonomy too. At the times, I really had the ability to write about, the subjects that I thought were important, and I had space in the paper to do it. So those were great luxuries and hard to give up. I think the opportunity was really, as you said, to look at the process from a different point of view, and to understand how it worked from this perspective. And it has been absolutely an education, even in 3 months, in that sense, in a fascinating way. And it's also, it's in some ways the job is similar. It seems like an extension of what I was doing before when I'm meeting on an individual project, let's say with architects and clients from various public agencies, and I'm offering thoughts about how the design might be improved. We're having a conversation about that. That's very similar. I'm using my brain in a very similar way to how I used to. In other ways, it's completely and radically different. And I would say the biggest, easiest way to explain that is just thinking about, how you build relationships and influence within city government, as opposed to my old job where I had a platform to, make a case.
Right.
For a particular project or approach. And it's also it's as complicated as writing criticism is. There's certain ways in which the product itself is quite discrete, and you're able to measure your progress in a very clear way in terms of what your output is as a critic, what's being published, and on what subjects. And it's very easy for the public also on the outside to get a sense of what you're doing, what you're focusing on, and all of that, of course, is much more amorphous within city government. So there's some places where I'm having, as I mentioned, direct conversations about the direction of a building or project, and others where it's really much more about building relationships and seeing what's possible. And there's so much happening that, of course, I'm not able, and it'd be foolish to try to wade into everything. And so I really have to figure out where the particular influence of an office like this can be most effective in helping advance what the mayor is interested in doing, helping advance, his goals about promoting good architecture and design across the city. So it's really thinking about how to be most effective, how we can make our investments in design architecture most efficient. So these various investments are complementary. So that part of the job is quite different. And the way I've explained it to other people is that, I have a clear sense already, although my list is probably too long and I do have to cull it down a little bit, but I have a clear sense of what I want to try to accomplish. And I've been, putting together that list in the time that I've been here and thinking about what's feasible. And because of my training as a critic in my old job, I have, it's not difficult for me to articulate why we need to do those things as a city, as a region. And the how is, of course, the tricky and interesting part. So what the most effective way to execute a particular goal is through the city government, where are the places where a particular idea that we have some consensus, about can gain traction and how it can be best promoted or executed. So that's really how I've been thinking about it. And there's no, as I said, there's no shortage of interesting places to kind of ask those questions.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting to me to think about, to hear you say that you see this as kind of there's a direct line from the work you were doing before to what you're doing now. And I completely agree with you. I want to come back to something you said very early on about how you don't regret, judgments necessarily, but, ways of the way you said it or the way you wrote it. And I'm kind of curious how that kind of craft of writing fits into this new role. And are you doing much writing, and how does writing kind of fit into developing these plans and building these relationships now?
So there are bits and pieces of writing, the part of what we do is there are, nominations for architects for various prizes. So I've been helping writing some of those applications. I've been writing in response to sort of interview questions, and then also articulating, within the city, my goals on various projects. But I have been thinking about the larger question, which is to say, should there be a kind of outlet? I think at certain moments when I want to make a case for a particular project, there are probably places where I can write a piece like that. But then in a more regular sense, I've been thinking about whether it would be useful to have some kind of regular outlet to write about important buildings, or as part of the public engagement process. I've been thinking a lot about the way that, Jonathan Gold, my former colleague, the food critic at the LA Times, who just died,
right,
and the great influence that he had in the city. And, he was a fascinating, I think his particular skill as a critic has been sort of under discussed. People have been talking about how he promoted a certain reading of Los Angeles, which he did, and changed the way food was written about. But even just for me as a fellow critic to think about how he approached the craft of criticism was quite interesting. His use of the second person, for example, which was really not an easy thing to do, to pull off, and he was really remarkably good at that. But I've been thinking about, on the one hand, he rarely wrote negative things about restaurants, and this is the difference, I suppose, between restaurants and architecture. You can ignore a new restaurant and choose not to go there in a way that is not true of a new skyscraper, right? And I think architecture critics have a responsibility to write about big new projects. And there's certain things that they really must, confront as critics.
Right.
Whereas, you can be a book critic or a restaurant critic and sort of choose things that you want to celebrate and promote in a different way. The exception to that was that he did this list every year of 101 restaurants, which the Times published as a book, which is incredible. You see it in every household in Los Angeles. And he actually made a point of ranking, not just including the best restaurants, but ranking them in order, which I thought was really fantastic in an age when most people say all these judgments are relative.
Right.
Really making a stand and saying, I have the expertise to say this is, in my view, the most significant restaurant right now in Los Angeles. I'm going to rank the rest of the 101 in order.
Right.
And so the way that book sort of as a document, operated in the city has made me think about, what role writing should or could play in my new position. And so my answer is I haven't quite figured that out, but it is something I've given some thought to.
Yeah. I mean, you're such a great writer, and someone that I've loved reading for so long that it almost feels a shame to for us to lose that. My last question, and this is a question that I end all of these conversations with, and you've mentioned so many people already in this conversation, but I'm really curious, who are the books, the writers, the critics that have really influenced how you think about all of this, or even the people that you're reading right now that's kind of shaping how you think about your new role?
Right. So I could give an extraordinarily long answer to this question. I did. I taught that class that I mentioned at U.C Berkeley, where I made a syllabus out of books about Los Angeles, and then I sort of recreated that in public when I did a project called Reading LA, I think 6 or 7 years ago now, where I read through the canon of literature of books about Los Angeles architecture and urbanism. So I ended up reading and writing short essays about, I think, 27 books altogether over the course of a year. So I was basically reading two books a month roughly. And so those were just nonfiction books with a couple of exceptions, just nonfiction books with single authors.
Okay.
So I was not reading, you could have a whole separate list of fiction that engages with, the built environment in Los Angeles. But so that was an incredibly useful exercise. And so the only conclusion I came to is special place in the canon for both explain all of Los Angeles in a kind of unified theory. So there are three really important. Carey McWilliams, who went on to edit The Nation, but came out of the LA Times in 1946, right after the war, called Los Angeles, an island on the land. And that was really the first comprehensive book about Los Angeles as a civic entity and in terms of its built environment and cultural history. And then Rainer Banham,
right,
a generation later in 1971, Architecture of Four Ecologies. And then Mike Davis's book, another 20 years almost after that, published in 1990, City of Quartz. So those three books stand out as the three books that really tried to make a
that's great
comprehensive argument about what Los Angeles meant. And then there are many writers, I would say Esther McCoy, who really invented architecture criticism.
Oh, yeah.
In Los Angeles, has been hugely influential. I teach Anna Devere Smith's play Twilight, Los Angeles, which is, if you're not familiar with her
I don't know that
theater, she really approaches it from a documentarian or journalistic point of view. So she interviews dozens and dozens of people, and then she turns that work into a one-woman show where she sort of channels the voices of these various characters. And she did one about the riot, about the civic unrest and Rodney King.
Oh, interesting.
Commissioned by Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles. And so that's a really remarkable document of Los Angeles at that moment, just a few years after the City of Quartz. So that's an important one. And then in terms of, more recent figures, Bill Deverell, who's a historian at USC, is a good friend of mine who's writing one of the most historians. His work on Los Angeles history has been really influential for me. He wrote one title I'll mention that he co-wrote with Greg Heiss was to rescue a 1929 plan by the Olmsted brothers, sons of Frederick Law Olmsted and Ellen Bartholomew, a landscape architect. They were commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce in the late 1920s to produce a really far-reaching open space, parks and open space plan for Los Angeles County, and they produced a document of really astonishing both design sophistication and political sophistication, calling for a whole connected network of parks, and also argued for letting land along the LA River stay undeveloped so that it could flood and be open space that could also collect stormwater. And it was so far-reaching. It even had sample documentation for legislation in the back. And for financing of these projects. And it was so forward-looking that I think it scared the Chamber of Commerce, and they realized that it might threaten the real estate ambitions of some of the members of the chamber who had commissioned the project, and so they shelved it. And then the depression, hit, and then it never recovered. So Bill Deverell and Greg Heiss rescued this document, republished it, sort of put it in historical context, and there's an afterward interview with Laurie Olin, the landscape architect. It's a fantastic book called Eden by Design, which I recommend. And then I would say these days, Alyssa, who you've talked to in terms of people writing about Los Angeles, my former colleague Carolina Miranda, writing about LA, Gustavo Arellano, who has written about food as well as LA and Orange County history, now writing a column for the LA Times. His work has meant a lot. And Jonathan Gold, of course, I'm thinking a lot about his work because of his recent death, but also just the way that he managed to use food criticism to tell a certain story about Los Angeles, and particularly about the kind of diaspora of immigrant communities, across the whole county, and stitch together a story about contemporary Los Angeles that was and the outpouring since his death has really made clear how important that larger story was to all of his readers. So, I'm sure many people have talked about Ada Louise Huxtable.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's interesting to talk about her work in connection with contemporary architectural criticism.
Okay.
I got to know her only a little bit late in her life, and her archive is now at the Getty. So I think that she will, there will be a really interesting relationship between her archive and Los Angeles over the next, several years, which is really fascinating to contemplate. But also, I think for me, she was always a model. She's remembered for having written about politics and real estate and planning and all those things that I mentioned. And she really did that. She did it in a very hard-nosed way. But I think what we sometimes forget is that if you go back and look at her work, her body of work in a typical year, she was also really writing quite a bit about architecture as architecture and individual architects' bodies of work and individual buildings. And so I think what's been lost a little bit is that she was writing across the whole spectrum, and that was always really my ambition, is not to neglect planning and politics and urbanism, but also not neglect the side of the spectrum, which is to say, architecture at the level of the individual building and the importance of reviews of individual buildings to the story that a city tells about itself. And so, we have been in one of the things I was trying to do in my last few years was not just honor the kind of political part of her legacy, but the other end of that spectrum, and really make a point of writing about individual buildings as well as these larger issues, because I think that is fundamental to the responsibility of any architecture critic. And she did that more than I think we sometimes tend to remember.
Yeah, that's great. That's I'm glad that you added that. And I think that you've done a good job of that also, and I can't wait to see kind of what you do next and what you do in this role. So, good luck with the new job, and thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh,
this
it's my pleasure.
A blast.
Thanks for the good questions. I appreciate it.
This episode was recorded on August 2nd, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.